have Hugh Duncan here. Hugh Duncan is going to tell us about some personal experiences, I believe. He's going to tell us about the life of
Rickover, Admiral Hyman G. Rickover.
Great. Thank you so much, Hugh, and I'll turn it over to you.
It was 63 years ago, in March of 1961, when I was waiting to go into Hyman Rickover's office in Washington, D.C. 63 years. I had a hard time wrapping my mind around that. Think back to where you were in March of 1961. John Kennedy had been inaugurated, our 35th president, 2 months before. TV was still in black and white. For the first time in a long time, Eisenhower was not in the news. I was 22 years old. I'd heard stories about the Admiral and about these interviews, and I was scared to death. When I went in, it was just the two of us in his office. And there he was behind the desk, dressed in a plain khaki shirt, no sign of rank, no tie, no fancy uniform. Boy, he sure didn't look like an admiral. Someone described him as scrawny, 5 feet 6 inches tall, 125 pounds. I think scrawny was a pretty good description. He was sharp-tongued, always demanding, frequently demeaning. As I said, I was scared to death. I'll come back later in the talk and tell you more about my meeting with the Admiral. That's what we all called him. There were lots of admirals in the Navy, but those of us in the nuclear power program called him the Admiral. So first of all, who was this Admiral Rickover? He's called the father of the nuclear Navy. And why is nuclear power important to the Navy? Well, the main application of nuclear power in the Navy is propulsion of submarines. In a previous time, World War II and thereafter, submarines were powered by batteries. And these were very quiet and very effective underwater, but batteries run down. And so these older submarines would periodically have to surface to get air to run their diesel generators to recharge the batteries. And when submarines are on the surface, they are very vulnerable. They're sitting ducks. So the main advantage of nuclear power is that submarines can stay underwater basically as long as they want to. Old World War II submarines could stay underwater for up to 2 days. The USS Nautilus, the first atomic submarine or nuclear submarine, could stay underwater for 2 weeks. Today's submarines have stayed underwater for 3 or 4 months. And today there are 72 nuclear-powered submarines in the U.S. Navy. The last diesel submarine was built in 1959 and went out of service in 1990. So we haven't had those old-style submarines for a long time. Hyman G. Rickover was born in a small town in Poland to a Jewish family in 1899. His father was a tailor. His birth name was Chaim Gadala Rickover. But when his family immigrated to America to escape the pogroms, which were organized massacres of Jewish people in the late 1800s, they changed his name to Hyman George Rickover. He was 7 years old when they arrived in Manhattan. They lived in New York for 2 years before moving to Chicago and living in a heavily Jewish neighborhood. He did well in high school, graduated in 1918, and his first job out of high school was delivering telegrams for Western Union. And it was through this job that he became acquainted with his congressman, who was also a Jewish, also a Jewish immigrant from Czechoslovakia. And his congressman gave him an appointment to the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis, Maryland. He graduated 107th out of 450 or 540 midshipmen in 1922. So he was in the top 20% of his class. During the period between his graduation and World War II, he got a master's degree in electrical engineering from Columbia. And he got married while he was at Columbia. I, for one, was surprised he was married. He was such a workaholic, I didn't think he would have time for marriage. And he was such a tyrant, I didn't think anybody would put up with him. But his marriage endured until his wife's death in 1972. They had one child, a boy named John. Admiral Rickover remarried or married again at age 74 to a nurse he met while hospitalized. And they were together for 12 years until his death in 1986. Rickover's first 25 years in the Navy were pretty unremarkable, except that he impressed his superiors with his work ethic and always getting the job done on time and within budget. During World War II, he was never in combat. He had few ribbons. You see these admirals with a chest full of ribbons. I think he had 12. In 1937, he became an engineering duty officer only, which would greatly restrict his future assignments to engineering, and he would never be the captain of a ship. Pretty much limited his naval career. How then do you explain his picture on the cover of Time magazine in 1954? Here's the answer. In 1946, Congress established the AEC, the Atomic Energy Commission. And Congress wanted to explore how this nuclear fission thing that had created the atomic bomb, how it could be used for peaceful use in the Navy. 6 Navy officers, led by Captain Rickover, were sent to Oak Ridge, Tennessee for a year to learn about nuclear reactor technology. He returned to Washington in 1947 and took every opportunity to argue for the creation of a nuclear power division in the Navy. Just 7 years after he got back to Washington, the USS Nautilus, the first nuclear submarine, was launched. And that's why his picture was on the cover of Time magazine. And just 3 years after the Nautilus was launched, it did the unthinkable. It went for 3 days under the ice cap and went to the North Pole. Now a U.S. submarine could go in any ocean, anytime, and stay as long as they desired. Everything changed for Rickover when he went to Oak Ridge. It was there he found his sweet spot. He was made for that assignment. By force of his technical skill and personal determination, he created the Navy nuclear power program, which today, as I said, consists of 72 submarines and 10 aircraft carriers. Many more have been built, and decommissioned, and there's never been any public danger from the operation of a Navy nuclear power plant. That's because Rickover always demanded the best from shipyards, from vendors, from his people, and his petty officers. Here's a quote from the Time magazine article. "Too often for their peace of mind, Navy men and civilian scientists at this nuclear facility, and generally on the weekend or at night, the word spreads amongst them, the Admiral is here. All hands tense and quicken at the sight, at the slight, spare human tornado that whirls through the shop. Few jobs are done fast enough or well enough to suit Admiral Hyman G. Rickover, top flight naval engineer and leader of this strange new development program. His passage leaves a boiling wake of lacerated egos. It also leaves a feeling, even amongst the lacerated, that something special is happening. And right away, Rickover stirred up controversy. Navy admirals wanted to put nuclear power on surface ships, but Rickover was convinced that submarines was the way to go. He didn't make any points with the other admirals when he went over their head to the top admiral in the Navy, Admiral Nimitz, and convinced him that submarines were the way to go. But that's the way he did business, and he made lots of enemies along the way. Here's another Time magazine quote. "Annapolis graduate Rickover, a man who knows what he wants and wants it done to perfection, has long warred with the Navy. He has wooed, bullied, and won over the Atomic Energy Commission. He has made great industrial corporations jump and like it when he cracks the whip. Some high Navy officers still deplore intense, single-minded Rickover. But when the first atomic submarine, the Nautilus, is launched at Groton, Connecticut on January 21st, the U.S. Navy will never be the same again." Before I go any further, if you haven't already grasped it, I should pause and say Rickover was not your typical Navy officer. You expect senior naval officers to be outgoing, tall, dark, handsome, nice, athletic, etc., etc. Rickover was short and skinny. He was an introvert. He was shy. He was very mean. He cussed a lot. He thought athletics and sports were a waste of time. You should be doing something more productive with your life. In short, he was a very complicated person. As one biographer noted, Rickover was the hardest working person I ever met, and he expected everyone who worked for him to do likewise. Another biographer said, "He was confrontational, insulting, a workaholic, little tolerance for mediocrity, and none for stupidity." I read an article written by his son, John. He said his dad didn't spend much time at home. I can believe that. He says, "But when my father was at home, he spent a lot of time on the telephone. And my mother and I could always tell whether he was talking to an errant contractor, loud cursing and yelling, one of his subordinates, never a hello or goodbye. Such niceties would waste precious seconds, or to a congressman or senator, very polite and very respectful." Well, when shipyards started building ships, nuclear ships, Rickover knew they would have to be built with greater precision and higher quality control than shipyards were used to. Change is not usually welcomed. and there was great resistance to these new standards. But Rickover's persistence carried the day. Today's safety standards and the reliability of nuclear power is a tribute to one man, Hyman Rickover. And today there are 55 commercial nuclear plants operating in 28 states. And I'm pretty sure that the operating crew of most of those is composed of a lot of ex-Navy nukes like me. That's what they called us, nukes. And now I'd like to return to my opening remarks about when I walked in the Admiral's office that early morning 63 years ago. I was a senior at the U.S. Naval Academy. I had grown up in North Carolina and got my appointment to the Naval Academy from Sam Erwin of Watergate fame, senator from North Carolina. The Admiral personally interviewed and approved every officer who entered his nuclear power program. And that's why I was in the Admiral's office for an interview to be admitted to the nuclear power program. And my class, the class of 1961, was the first time he had taken people straight out of college. Before that, everyone like Jimmy Carter had come in from the fleet and had a few years of experience under their belt. And speaking of Jimmy Carter, in his autobiography called Why Not the Best, he says that Admiral Rickover influenced my life more than anybody else other than my parents. And the very title of the autobiography, only Why Not the Best, he said came from his interview with Admiral Rickover. Rickover said, when you were in the Naval Academy, did you always do your best? And Carter said, I initially said yes, but then I got to thinking, I said, no, Admiral, not all the time. And he said, then he asked me a question I've never forgotten, and I haven't ever been able to fully answer. Rickover said, why not? Hence the title of his autobiography, Why Not the Best? Over the years, Rickover did 14,000 of these early morning interviews before the work day. I think I went into his office about 6 in the morning. As I said, when I came in the office, there were just the two of us. There he was, seated behind his desk in civilian clothes. I read in one book that uniforms weren't permitted in his office, because he wanted all decisions to be made strictly on the basis of technical merit and not because it was Captain so-and-so's pet project. I think the purpose of these selection interviews was to get you off balance and see how you handled uncomfortable situations. I distinctly remember 2 questions he asked me. First question was, why did your grades drop last semester? I mean, he knew that kind of detail about every person, these 14,000 people, that my grades had dropped. I thought I had the perfect explanation. I said, Admiral, during the week of final exams, I had the flu and I was in sick bay, and I had to take those exams in second semester. He says, God damn it, I'm not looking for excuses. Boy, that kind of set me back a little bit. I don't remember where the conversation went from there. And another question he asked me is, where are you going to stand in your class? I said, I don't know, Admiral. I'll work hard, I'll study hard, I'll stand. Did you not understand the goddamn question? I said, well, Admiral, I can't. He said, where are you going to stand in your class? I don't know where I got it. I said, 15th. And he says, okay, you stand 15th in your class and you'll get my program. That's it. I ushered me out. Well, I didn't quite stand 15th. I stood 29th. But I got into the program anyway. I think he just wanted me to give him a number to commit. And while I'm talking about the program, maybe I'll tell you about the year of training that he had everybody go through, including me. It was a year-long training. The first 6 months were classroom instruction in nuclear theory and and other topics, postgraduate kind of classes. Mine was at Mare Island Naval Shipyard in Vallejo, California. There, the Naval Academy folks were joined by graduates from other universities entering the program. One of my classmates was a Navy captain en route to command an aircraft carrier, and he had to go through the same year of training that us lowly ensigns did. At the end of 6 months, we had to declare whether we wanted to go into surface ships or submarines. I figured I couldn't handle the confined space of a submarine for months at a time, and so I opted for surface ships. The next phase of our training was 6 months at a full-size nuclear reactor. In my case, it was in upstate New York, near Saratoga Springs, New York. Here you stood watches, you had hands-on experience, you learned to operate the plant, and took both written and oral exams. Rickover was big on oral exams. Everywhere I went, there were oral. Once you complete that year's training, you go to your ship, and my ship was the USS Enterprise, nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. 5,000 men aboard, 5,000 people, kind of a small village. Flight deck was 1/4 mile long. The ship was powered by 8 nuclear reactors. It was the biggest ship in the world at the time. Shortly after I came aboard, we went out to sea to avoid a hurricane. And when we were out to sea for over a week, everybody's saying, "Why haven't we gone back to Norfolk? The hurricane must be gone." Well, one night, matter of fact, the night of October 16th, 1962, the captain came on the announcing system and said, "In 15 minutes, President Kennedy will address the nation and announce the embargo of Cuba. We're presently steaming 15 miles off the coast of Cuba, and we will be the flagship." Biggest ship in the world. I didn't sleep very well for the next few nights, for sure. I spent 2 years on board the Enterprise and then 3 years at a nuclear reactor in the Idaho desert, training people, going through the same kind of training I had gone through. And so back to the good admiral. He almost didn't make admiral. The way the Navy works is there's a selection board to consider all Navy captains up for promotion. Only 5% are selected, and 95% are forced to retire after 30 years. As I said, Rickover had made lots of enemies over the years, and they thought they could get rid of him by passing him over for promotion. When the list was announced, sure enough, his name was not on it. Congress was outraged. Lots of other people were outraged. So Congress made him a rear admiral. Never before and never since has such a thing happened in the Navy. Congress loved Rickover. He always delivered things on time and within budget. He once returned $1 million to the U.S. Treasury for a program he brought in under budget. The senator who was listening to his testimony about the $1 million said, "Did the Treasury Department have a form to fill out when you sent them that money?" Rickover said, "No, they really didn't know how to handle it." In 1958, the crew of the Nautilus that had gone under the North Pole was invited to the White House by President Eisenhower. But Rickover's name was not on the invitation list that the Navy gave to the White House. So he didn't get invited and didn't attend. Again, Congress was really upset. And Congress promoted him to Vice Admiral. And then they awarded him the Congressional Gold Medal. I'd never heard of the Congressional Gold Medal, so I looked it up. It was established in 1776, right at the time of the Revolutionary War. It's for distinguished national appreciation for distinguished achievements and contributions by individuals. And since then, since 1776, only 173 people have gotten that award. You'll recognize some of the names: John Paul Jones, Andrew Jackson, Cornelius Vanderbilt, Charles Lindbergh, Thomas Edison, Walter Reed, Jonas Salk. What an interesting list. Harry Chapin, Rosa Parks, Bob Hope. Anyway, Hyman G. Rickover is only one of 4 people who have gotten that award twice. He got it in 1958 for his contributions to the Navy, and in 1982 for his contributions to the development of nuclear power, both in the U.S. and other places. And then also in 1982, Congress promoted him again to 4 stars, one of only 8 4-star admirals in the Navy. Although Rickover was a Naval Academy graduate, he was an outsider in the Navy. He was foreign born, he was Polish, he was Jewish. As a matter of fact, he was the first Jewish admiral in the Navy. And he was not a team player. So he created his own team, the Nuclear Navy. And I was proud to be a part of it for 5 years. I'm sure I'm a better person today for going through the rigors of working under the heavy hand of Admiral Hyman Rickover. I've got one final personal story about the Admiral that involved me. The setting is a Navy training reactor on the Idaho desert in 1964. I'm the shift supervisor of the midnight shift of the reactor. It's been shut down for maintenance and it's getting ready to start up for more training. It's about 3 a.m. in the morning when I decided to take a tour of the plant. I stopped by the control room and saw they were pulling rods to take the reactor critical, which is how you start up the reactor. On my walk around the plant, lo and behold, I discovered the door to the reactor compartment, which was supposed to be locked, was standing open. I ran to the control room and ordered a shutdown. We had avoided a potential problem because we hadn't ever got critical, so there wasn't a problem. But when the reactor is critical, there's high radiation in that space, and the reason you lock the door is you don't want anybody in there. As a result of this incident, I had to put 4 of my best people on report for failure to catch the problem. And a week or so later, I would be going to captain's mast. That's M-A-S-T, not mass. Going with them, and I knew that the CO was going to throw the book at them. Captain's mast is when the commanding officer of a ship or a base hears the cases of enlisted people charged with committing offenses and awards punishment. I suspected they were going to be reduced in rank and thrown out of the nuclear program, for these had been serious mistakes. Well, on the day of captain's mast, lo and behold, Admiral Rickover happened to be on site. I didn't know this, but he and the commanding officer had lunch together. And the commanding officer His name was Commander Yogi Kaufman. He later became Vice Admiral Yogi Kaufman. And while Vice Admiral, he wrote an article, and the title of the article is SOB or KOG. Well, you know what SOB is, and a lot of people thought that Rickover was an SOB. But Yogi had known Rickover for 31 years, and he knew that at times he could be a kindly old gentleman, a KOG. Here's what he said in his article. In 1964, we had an incident that could have been very serious if an alert young engineering officer, that's me, had not sensed the situation and shut the plant down. He continued, Rickover was visiting and obviously interested in this incident. He asked me at lunch what I was going to do, what punishment I was going to award. When I told him, he said, you know, Kaufman, maybe you're being too hard in this case. I hear these guys are some of our best people. You know, we really can't afford to hurt really good people. They're too hard to come by. Our training paid off. Your team prevented a serious problem, and people will always make mistakes. Could you go easy on them? Could you do that for me? And let them know that I interceded for them, okay? Then tell me what reaction you get. Well, I didn't know anything about this when I went with my four guys to captain's mast. I was expecting the worst. And at captain's mast, Commander Kaufman said, gentlemen, I'm not going to tell you what I plan to do today, but a few hours ago I had lunch with Admiral Rickover, and he interceded for you. He then proceeded to give them what amounted to a slap on the wrist. Each was given a temporary reduction in rank, and if they kept their noses clean for 6 months, their rank would be restored. I was stunned. Some of these hardened sailors started to fight back tears. They were expecting the worst too. The word of what happened and that the Admiral had interceded for these 4 enlisted men spread like wildfire across the 1,200 troops at that site. No one on that base would sign up for a hate Rickover club that day. As my former CO said, you could almost cut off slices of blooming, surging morale and serve it up. And he said, when I called the Admiral the next day to report the results, Rickover said, now you see, will you agree that you can learn something from me? Well, when Rickover retired finally at age 82, it was not voluntary. He always had powerful friends in the House and Senate that had ensured he remain on active duty long past the normal retirement age. But the Secretary of the Navy felt that Rickover's achievements were in the past, and he convinced President Ronald Reagan that Rickover needed to go. And so in January of 1982, he was forced to retire after 63 years on active duty. He had served under 13 presidents, from Woodrow Wilson to Ronald Reagan. He served longer on active duty than anyone in the history of the U.S. Armed Forces. Shortly after his retirement, a party honoring Admiral Rickover was attended by all 3 living former presidents, Carter, Ford, and Nixon. They were all former Navy officers. On July 4th, 1985, Rickover suffered what was described as a serious stroke and was admitted to Bethesda Naval Hospital, and thereafter had a partial paralysis of his right side. He died a year later in 1986 at his home in Arlington. He was buried in a small private ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery. A few quotes from his obituary in the Washington Post. Admiral Rickover was a symbol of excellence. He often bulldozed his way through red tape and roadblocks. His energy and his flamboyance mobilized wide public and congressional support. I want you to look at the picture on the right over here. Isn't it only in America that the immigrant son of a tailor, a Jewish tailor, a refugee who escaped poverty and violence in his native Poland, could be sitting in the Oval Office with the President of the United States, an admiral in civilian clothing, no less, only in America. On July 14th, a memorial service was led by Admiral James Watkins at the Washington National Cathedral. President Carter and other dignitaries were there, as well as about 1,000 other people. At the request of the Admiral's widow, President Carter read a sonnet by John Milton. The Secretary of the Navy said, "With the death of Admiral Rickover, the Navy and the nation has lost a dedicated officer of historic accomplishment. In his 63 years of service, Admiral Rickover took the concept of nuclear power from an idea to the present reality." And then the Chief of Naval Operations said, "Most important, he was a teacher. He set the standards. They were tough. That is his legacy and the challenge he left to all who study his contributions." Rickover is buried in Section 5 of Arlington National Cemetery. And again, I'm very proud to have been a part of his nuclear navy for 5 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hugh. What an interesting story. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. Do appreciate it. Now, do we have any questions? And oh, there's one. Comments?
Go Navy.
Beat Army.
No, now I'll tell my short Admiral Rickover story. I was fortunate enough to meet him while I was in medical school in Philadelphia. And we were working on the human centrifuge. They didn't have it in Houston in those days, so we were working with other medical students. There were 3 or 4 of us, a couple guys from Northwestern and Jefferson. And we got to meet all the original astronauts, or the Mercury astronauts in the course of this action. And they thought we did such a good job that we had to go down to Washington to meet the head of the Bureau of Medicine and Surgery. And that sounded just hunky-dory with us. So they put us on an airplane and we went down. And he said, "Well, I have a nice surprise for you guys today." And we said, "What's that?" He said, "Well, Admiral Rickover just happens to be in the building and has a short pause that we can perhaps have some lunch with you guys. He'd like to meet you." And of course, every ship, every boat that goes out, old slang, has to have a medical officer on it. That's not true with most Navy ships. They'll have senior corpsmen and all on them. Maybe a squadron will have a doctor. But every single nuclear submarine has a doctor aboard. And of course, they were treated like everybody else. The final interview was with Admiral Rickover, and I've heard some stories about them, let's put it that way. Pretty much what you said. But anyhow, he came in and we sat down and we had a private room for lunch and all. Peaches and cream. And he asked us who we were and what our thoughts were. And of course, we were only in second year of medical school. We didn't have any idea. He said, "Well, I'll tell you what, we're always looking for good people for our submarines. And I'll tell you what, I'll give you my card and my private number's on there. And if any of you are interested, just give my office a call and I'll be sure you get an interview. And I don't really know if any of us did. I didn't, but he filled the room. I mean, he just absolutely filled the room when he walked into a room. There's certain people that can do that. And I have another question to ask you then, but he was truly one of the great, he and Nimitz and people like this were the fathers of our Navy, when you get right down to it. Some other ones too, but when you were on the Enterprise, what years were you on the Enterprise? Big E.
62 to 64.
Well, I had an occasion. Were you ever over in Vietnam waters?
No, always
Okay.
in the Atlantic.
Well, I was in Vietnam in '65, and I think the Big E was up at Yankee Station at that point. I'm not sure. But I had the interesting experience to land on a helicopter on the Big E, get piped aboard, the whole business, and I was wondering who they thought I was, to be honest with you. But I understand they're going to build another carrier, another Big E, by the way, which I think is appropriate. And thank you for your excellent presentation. It's just, people don't realize, most people in this room don't realize, there's our deterrent to war right there. When you put those babies under the Arctic, the Russians cannot track them very well to this day, from what I understand. And if a war, we don't want war. Everybody knows that. And that is the biggest reason why Russia would be very, very hesitant to do anything about it. The fact they can't track them, and our fleet could destroy the world. We don't want that to happen either. We're peaceful people. But thank you for your presentation.
Thank you. One of Rickover's quotes was, "The more you sweat in peacetime, the less you bleed in wartime."
My brother was a contemporary of yours. He served in the nuclear navy. His name was Gerald Schumann.
I don't think so.
He served on. He was. I'm big. I'm tall. He was about half my size and twice as smart. But he served in the nuclear navy. He was on a sub.
Oh. Well, thank you very much. I've been a wonderful audience. Appreciate it very much.
Thank all of you, and thanks to our tech team back there that does an outstanding job. They're always here for us, and be sure to come back in 2 weeks' time because we've got more for you.